question, how does Priestley explore the ideas of status and power in an Inspector Calls? So before we begin looking at that question, I just wanted to align your minds to the text if you've not looked at it for a little while. So the little summary at the top there just gives an overview as to what the play is about. And Inspector Calls is by Priestley. It's a play that revolves around the apparent suicide of a young woman called Eva Smith. And the unsuspecting Burling family are visited by Inspector Gould. He arrives as they're celebrating the engagement of Sheila Burling to Gerald Croft. And the inspector reveals that a girl called Eva Smith has taken her own life by drinking disinfectant. The family are horrified, but they're confused as to why the inspector is questioning them and wanting to tell them about this story. What follows then is the tense and uncomfortable realisation and investigation of the characters that they were all involved and that they all contributed to this girl's death. In terms of the social and historical context, an Inspector Calls was first performed in 1945, and that was a period of great change. The world had just had the 2 World Wars. They were thinking about the fact that so many people had died. There was a lot of conflict, and in the minds of people, there was lots of ill feeling. Women had become more prominent in the workplace to take the place of men as they went off to war, and there was more class mobility at this time. It wasn't perfect, arguably it still isn't, but there was more class mobility in the period following the Second World War. The play, though, was set in 1912, so the characters, when the characters are performing, they have no recollection, they have no knowledge of these world events. And so Priestley uses this fact to make some important points about society and responsibility, about what the country in 1945 should perhaps take a look at and learn from. So when we get our question in the exam, you'll remember that you are given a choice of 2 questions in the exam, and you are not given an extract for an Inspector Calls. So you need to have a good working knowledge of quotations and the context in which those quotations are found in order for you to answer the question clearly. Today we're going to be investigating just one question, the idea of status and power, because this question gives us a good insight into several of the characters and the key ideas that run through this play. So when we get the question, we need to unpack that question a little bit and unpick it. So we need to think about the key words in that question, status and power. Now, if we think about status, it's the idea of someone having a social or professional position in society. And so we think about the perhaps social and professional positions that some of the characters in an Inspector Calls have. We already know that they have higher levels of status than someone like Eva Smith. Power is also an interesting word. The idea of power is to have influence over people, to be able to impact change. And that doesn't necessarily mean that that's positive change. It could be negative change as well. So that's important to consider in terms of who is impacting change and what's the outcome of that change. So when we think about our question, we need to think about the context of the text. And we've briefly started talking about that already. We need to consider that there was still a class system present in Britain at the time, that business was starting to recover following the World Wars, and that businessmen were particularly keen to earn more money, get back up and running as quickly as possible. But at the time of the play, there was a threat of war. In 1912, the First World War hadn't been declared. And so there was a threat of war looming and starting to gain momentum in society. In the 1945 publication, we talked about the contrast then with the 1912 setting and the use of dramatic irony by Priestley. So the fact that the people watching this play, the audience watching the play in 1945, will have experienced what was happening more than likely in 1912, will have heard about it as recent history. And so that post-war release of the play is really important because it's asking the audience to look back and reflect and think about what life is like in a 1945 world. Priestley's socialist views are also really important for this play, and his views on responsibility and looking after each other are also really key themes that run throughout the text. The realism of the play, the fact that it's a family and we're experiencing the conflicts of that family is also an important point to consider. And the idea that status and power at the time, both at the time that the text was written, 1945, and the time that the text was set, the status and power could be corruptive in society and could cause lots of damage. So after we've thought about kind of the generalised context of the text and some key points to do with status and power, we need to then start thinking about our key quotations. And we've got just a selection of key quotations here that we could use in relation to this question. Now you can of course pause the video, have a good look through these quotations. This isn't a kind of full list, it's just a selection of quotes that came to mind when I thought about the key question. You could of course think of your own quotations. But we've got some of the really obvious quotes, the ones that everyone remembers. Mr. Berlin saying that the Titanic is unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. Thinking about the fact that he's talked about his knighthood and that Priestley introduces him as being provincial in his speech. We've then got Sheila and her reliance on Gerald and wanting to wear a ring that Gerald wanted her to have rather than to have a thought process of her own. And the fact that she also used her political standing and her status in order to have Eva Smith fired from Millwards because she looked at her in the wrong way. I've popped on there Mrs. Berlin, the fact that when she heard about Eva Smith's story coming through the women's charity, she wasn't satisfied with it, so she had her influence to have the pledge refused. And that's quite interesting. It's a clear reference to that status that Mrs. Berlin thinks she has in society. We've also got that quotation that many of you will remember about girls of that class and Mrs. Berlin referring to Eva Smith in quite a derogatory fashion. I've got quite a few quotations about the inspector because naturally in his position in society as an inspector he will have held a lot of power and a lot of status, but particularly in this story when making reference to the other characters he holds a lot of power over them. So his description as having an impression of massiveness, solidity and purposefulness is important. The idea that he speaks carefully and weightily. So what he says is presented by Priestley as being really important and really mattering. He also talks about responsibility, which links to Priestley's viewpoints and his political standing. And he says towards the end of the text that, and I tell you that the time will come when, if men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. So his reference to what will happen if the Berlin family don't make a change, don't shift their viewpoint, and then more widely as a country, if the country didn't shift their viewpoint, then he was making reference to what the aftermath of that would be. Now, I've just popped there at the end in terms of a structural feature, the idea that the phone rings again at the end of the play. And Priestley's almost saying that the Berlin family haven't learnt their lesson yet. They've not learnt how to change. They've not all changed their viewpoint as much as Sheila and perhaps Eric does, but some of them are still holding on to those kind of old-fashioned archaic values like Mr. Berlin and Mrs. Berlin. We've also got Eva Smith here. She has a lack of social power, a lack of status all throughout the play. The fact that she's already dead and so we don't hear her voice, she's just talked about, is one key reason how she's got less power and less status in the play, but also how she's referenced throughout the play, and they talk about her in terms of how pretty she was. That's important because she's almost objectified, and we can start to delve into some of those ideas about gender and about the different levels of power that different genders had in society at the time. So We've done a quick overview as to some key quotations that come to mind when we think about status and power in an inspector calls. We then need to think about how we might draw that into a response. And this is a key point in your planning. You must jot down the thought process that you're going to go through as you write your essay. There's no point in starting an answer if you don't know where that answer is going to end up. It won't be clear, it won't be focused, it won't be relevant. And they're key words in the mark scheme for you to score good marks. You need to explain your responses for a grade 4. You need to make sure that those explanations are detailed and are clear as you work up through grade 5 and into grade 6. And then you're developing a more perceptive point of view, a sophistication in your writing as you go upwards to grade 7, 8 and 9. So it's it's crucially important that you plan your response. So we're going to think about our planning. We're going to start with our introduction. So how was Priestley actually presenting status and power in the play? Okay, so we need to think about, we need to think about how he was presenting status and power, and the idea that he was talking and making reference to status and power being a corrupting force. He created these contrasting characters of Mr. Berlin and Inspector Gould in order to explore that idea, and we can tie in Priestley's own views about status and power and social responsibility here. We then think about paragraph 1. So I'm going to talk about Berlin's power. It's who we hear about first of all in the play. And we need to think about how his views about war not happening, remember in 1912, the fact that the Titanic had been built and he believed that it just wouldn't sink, and his capitalist viewpoints about business. We also need to then consider the fact that actually Priestley is presenting Berlin as being quite naive, quite foolish, narrow-minded and selfish, and he's quite corrupt in order to save his own social status. In paragraph 2 then, I'm going to talk about the inspector, whoopsie-daisy, the opposite of Mr. Berlin, the idea that he believes that, or is presented by Priestley as believing that we should all take responsibility for each other, his socialist viewpoint, the idea of equality. His viewpoints being more direct, he's not corrupted by the power that he holds, and he's naturally authoritative. Paragraph 3, I'm going to take a look at gender and power and think about how Mrs. Berlin and Sheila are presented at the start, but how there is a gender inequality in terms of Eva Smith and the comparisons that can be made between Eva Smith and Sheila, for example. She's manipulated as a character, is Eva Smith. She's victimised by the upper classes, and that's an important point to make in terms of this status and power question. So once we've drawn together a quick plan, and that shouldn't take you very long, it should only take a couple of minutes to think about kind of the keystones of your essay and the key points that you want to make. You're then going to go on to write your response. And that's really important to think about the planning, your quotations, and then you need to be thinking about these key points of what, of how, and of why. And this time I've highlighted as I've written, so you'll be able to see how I'm addressing the 3 assessment objectives in my response. We start off always, as we did with our plan, with the introduction. So, in this play, Priestley presents status and power as a corrupting force that extends the gap that exists between social classes. Priestley uses the opposing characters of Mr. Berlin and Inspector Gould to explore his own political and ideological beliefs. So here, I've identified the type of text that I'm looking at. Lots of people sometimes fall into the trap of writing novel because that's what they used to study, but we're studying a play, so make sure that's clear. We've identified the writer, Priestley, and we've used the keywords from the question straight away, status and power. And we've made a clear point here that power is a corrupting force that's important for the rest of the essay. I've also introduced 2 of my main arguments about the fact of Mr. Berlin and Inspector Gould and their contrast as a set of characters. So, clear introduction there. We're going to go on to our first point about quotations. So, we look at, in Act 1, Berlin's power is evident through his control of the narrative before the inspector arrives. He uses his daughter's engagement, one that enhances his own social status, which is important because the Croft family is of a higher social status than the Berlins. He uses this as a jumping-off point for promoting his own political viewpoint, one that is completely at odds with Priestley's, and therefore one that Priestley seeks to challenge in his depiction of Berlin. For example, Berlin's declaration that war will not happen and that the Titanic is unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. So here, just before we go on to explore that quotation, we've got a clear point. Berlin's power is evident in his control of the narrative, and we've also thought about his political viewpoint and how that's being conveyed. We've also tied in a little bit of the how, so the idea of Priestley's viewpoints and how Priestley is challenging different viewpoints through his use of character, and we've introduced a quotation. So we're well on our way in terms of making a clear point and a clear explanation. We need to, though, go on to explore this quotation. So after here, we've got a little bit of the how, so thinking about how Priestley uses language. So Priestley uses dramatic irony to emphasise Berlin's naivete and provincial perspective. So another embedded quotation here. He cannot apprehend that a capitalist venture such as the Titanic would ever sink, because he cannot conceive that capitalism would ever sink and socialism succeed in its place. This not only suggests to the audience that Berlin is a foolish man, it also suggests that he is not quite the hard-headed man of business, another embedded quotation, that he makes himself out to be. Otherwise, he would be more pragmatic and would be preparing for the impact that a possible war might have on his business. So here, I've thought about what Priestley is using, how he's using language here, and I'm using quotations to support the point that I'm making. I'm also making sure that I explain this idea of the Titanic. It's a key point in the text in terms of showing Berlin's viewpoints. I'm going to take that a little bit further then and push a little bit higher, and this is where we can start to access the higher grades. So furthermore, Priestley is using the Titanic as a motif, a symbol of how power and status can easily be overturned or disrupted. So I'm back to those keywords in the question, power and status, and what can happen with them. In the case of the Titanic, hubris, Berlin is a hubristic character, and so the Titanic was part of a hubristic process. So hubris was one of the reasons it sank. Had it been going more slowly, it might have been able to turn in advance of the iceberg and therefore avoid disaster. In a similar way, the Berlin family are given opportunities to change direction and apologise for their behaviour. Their failure to do so and to instead see it as a hoax and a fake is the reason that the phone has to ring at the end of the play. They have failed to learn their lesson and so must be taught again. So here, I'm looking at the language being used, I'm looking at the technique of dramatic irony, but I'm starting to pick up some structural discussion, and this is where we get up into the higher grades here. So a motif or a symbol, and we also think about the structural decision of the phone ringing at the end of the play again, all adds to this idea that the Berlins, and indeed in Priestley's opinion, society has not learnt from the events of the World War. Next up, we think about a point leading to later on in the play. So even when Berlin is convinced by the inspector, he is not so concerned with Eva Smith's death, which he takes no responsibility for, but rather the scandal that his son's actions might cause in society, potentially affecting his social status and his allegedly impending knighthood. The pinnacle of this comes when he offers thousands, yes thousands, presumably to make the scandal disappear, demonstrating how thoroughly corrupted he is by his desperation to preserve his social status and position of power. Priestley uses this to show the corrupting influence of power and the dangers it poses to the most vulnerable and voiceless in society. So here again, I've built in some key quotations to explore my point of view. I've thought about the characterisation of Berlin and how Priestley has created him and what kind of characteristics comes out by the end of the play. And I've brought it back to the keywords in the question: social status and position of power. And that's really important in terms of the focus of the entire answer. I've then tied my response down with a little bit of the why, the idea of Priestley's point of view and what he was trying to say about society at the time of writing the play. So if we look back, we'll see that so far we've got lots of the how, we've got lots of the what, and we're starting to build in that why. And as I was continuing writing, I might want to think about developing that in a little bit more detail. However, the why doesn't carry as many marks as the what and the how. So there is a bit of a balancing act to be done there. So as this essay continues, you're going to take up the reins and continue writing. You might want to follow the rest of my plan and now look at the inspector and how he is presented, and then go on to look at gender and power. However, you may want to create your own plan and think about some of the other quotations that I found in my gathering of quotes here, but you might also want to come up with some of your own. What you're ultimately going to do is write the remainder of this essay so that you can prepare and practice the skill in preparation for writing something more independently. Thanks very much. Keep safe, and I'll see you soon.